You don't hear Latin too much anymore. It's a dead language, they say. But there is a famous Latin phrase that is still alive and kicking. The phrase, in its original context in Latin, is omnia vincit amor, better known to us as love conquers all. Since the Renaissance, we've embraced that phrase, love conquers all, like a proverb, a pearl of wisdom, like don't give up. No matter what your obstacles are, love will conquer them. Love wins. But what's gotten lost over the past, say, 700 or so years is the phrase love conquers all. In Virgil's original poem, conceived more than 2,000 years ago in the time of Julius Caesar, these are not the words of romantic triumph. In that poem, those are the words uttered by a man who is dying of heartbreak, a man who has fallen in love with the wrong woman. Nearly everyone around him in ancient Rome knows this thing is doomed. Both mortals and gods alike. Even the Roman god Apollo comes down from Mount Olympus to ask this man, quid insanus? Which basically means, dude, are you nuts? But well, in Virgil's version of events, this man can't help himself. So when he says, love conquers all, as he's dying, what he means is love conquers all reason, love conquers all common sense, and you just have to surrender to the madness of love, knowing it'll make you do things you never thought you would ever do. Because love, it conquered you. And hey, we've all been there. Which brings us to tonight's episode. A story about a woman who falls madly in love with a man she meets online. And this relationship is a passionate whirlwind. Only when she discovers this man has a horrific secret, she must decide if she will come to her senses and break things off with this potentially dangerous person, or will she surrender all reason, even abandon her own conscience, and let love, indeed, conquer all, including justice. This is Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, and this is a unique episode. Usually, I try and highlight true crime stories I love by people I admire. But tonight's episode is a little different. It draws from a recent Netflix documentary that, for me, missed the mark. It's called Should I Marry a Murderer? A sensational title if there ever was one. And it's one of those 3-part Netflix documentaries that somehow is too long, but yet doesn't deliver enough substance. At least it didn't for me. I found myself having a lot of questions. Not just about the woman who tells her side of the story in this documentary, but also the real event, the victim, the suspects, and a lot of the stuff that I felt was missing in between. And so I felt compelled to start researching this case to get a bigger picture. And it was a pretty big case in the UK. So I drew from some of the coverage from mainstream media outlets, along with other more obscure references for the unusual and distinct details to make it a dead sleep story. And one of the key sources is actually a series the BBC did, one that had an unexpected and stunning impact on the outcome of this case. And you'll hear more about that later in the episode. And as always, I will link to those key sources in the show notes. So if you've seen the documentary Should I Marry a Murderer and felt maybe a little frustrated, as I did, then you will appreciate this episode. Likewise, if you haven't seen the documentary and don't plan on watching it, you might also enjoy this episode. And if you haven't watched the documentary but you are planning on it and you don't want to know what happens beforehand, then please watch the documentary first and then come back to this episode. For the rest of us, we're going to begin where I think this story should begin, with our victim, 63-year-old Tony Parsons. And the moment the wheels of this whole tragedy were set in motion. It was Friday, September 29th, 2017, when Tony Parsons disembarked from his train, arriving at his planned destination, a nook of a little town in western Scottish Highlands called Fort William. But Fort William wasn't the end of his journey. It was actually a starting point. 103 miles to the southeast was his actual destination, his hometown of Tillicoultry, known by the locals as Tilly. The plan for Tony was to ride his bicycle from Fort William all the way home to Tilly. And as he hoisted his trusty yellow mountain bike from that train, there wasn't a doubt in his mind he'd get it done. His was a solo journey, just Tony and his bike, but he was far from alone. Alongside him, at least in spirit, were the hundreds, maybe even thousands of people Tony's bike ride might help. Tony was himself a cancer survivor. He overcame prostate cancer a few years earlier, and being the generous and kind soul he was, Tony wanted to share his gratitude and pay it forward. He'd spent the past few months raising funds for his ride, with those donations all going to a local cancer charity. Tony wasn't the most experienced cyclist. He wasn't in all that great of physical shape, really. But what he lacked in body strength, he easily made up for with his big heart and iron will. Tony was very stubborn. His wife Margaret knew there was no hope of talking him out of this ride. Tony and Margaret had been married for 40 years. Love at first sight when she was a 17-year-old checkout girl at a local market. And in all of those years together, she learned that Tony would do whatever he set his mind to, whether she liked it or not. No doubt Tony Parsons had grit. He spent most of his adult life in the Navy where he manned submarines. It was common for Tony in his line of work to live inside a military submarine for weeks, sometimes months, which meant he knew how to get along with others in tight quarters, but more important, he knew how to stay mentally tough when life on that submarine became a grind. Since he retired, Tony tried to make up for all the lost time with his wife and family, spending as much time as he could with his 2 adult children, a son and daughter, and his grandchildren. So maybe this epic bike ride was a way for him to test his mettle, see if he still got it. Tony asked a longtime buddy of his if he wanted to join him, but his friend, who was also in his 60s, said, "A 100-mile bike ride? No thanks." But Tony had already committed to doing it, and if he waited much longer, it was going to be too cold and too late. So he decided to do it solo. You know, the whole man versus nature, man versus himself. For Tony, being a cancer survivor It made him feel more grateful and more fearless. If he handled cancer, he could handle anything. He assured his family he was going to take his time. This wasn't a race. Slow and steady. Easy does it. Just a nice, calm ride through the hills and valleys of the unspoiled Scottish Highlands. Undoubtedly, some of the most beautiful, breathtaking scenery on Earth. A place so peaceful, so quiet. It was a retreat from civilization. A place that felt like the edge of the earth. With that in mind, Tony couldn't say exactly when he would be back. He estimated Saturday night, maybe Sunday morning. And if he wasn't back by Monday, well, send in the search party, he joked. Who knew what to expect with this Scottish climate? Scotland is a small country, about the size of South Carolina, with a total population of just over 5 million people. Scotland shares a southern border with England. The rest of the country is surrounded by water, with a bunch of little isles scattered nearby, as if someone once dropped the entire country on the floor and couldn't put the broken pieces back together. So Scotland is essentially an archipelago, surrounded by ocean and sea on 3 sides. There's the Atlantic Ocean to the north and west, the North Sea along the north and east, and the Irish Sea towards the south. Scotland's maritime location keeps the temperature relatively mild, but the jet stream and various air masses are known for creating what's been called a battlefield, a collision of meteorological forces that keep Scotland weather in constant flux, with unpredictable microclimates. And this unpredictability is just part of life in Scotland. So when it began to rain on Tony early in his journey that Friday, he didn't think much of it. If you waited for the rain to stop in Scotland to do something, you'd never get anything done. So this rain, big deal. The Scots might have called it a mizzle. Scottish have over 100 words for all kinds of rain, and a mizzle was a light misty rain. And that, in the mind of someone like Tony, was practically picnicking weather. So Tony pushed off from Fort William and started to pedal. Soon he was cruising through the charming villages and enjoying the ride. As he pedaled along, the rain fell harder, going from a light mizzle to a heavier rain the Scottish famously referred to as dreich. Well, when they say it, it's pretty charming. The spelling of that word is D-R-E-I-C-H. It's a kind of weather that's bleak, cold, gray, and unrelenting. When confronting dreich, most reasonable Scots stay cozy and warm indoors with a cup of tea and an oatcake, or maybe a wee dram of their famous Laphroaig single malt scotch. But Tony, he pressed on, continuing as the rain fell and the sun, wherever it was, finally slipped away. Tony's greatest enemy was time. He got a late start. He ventured out around 4 o'clock, which meant by 7 o'clock it would get dark. But Tony kept pedaling, his little headlamp on his helmet lighting the way. Tony's planned route from Fort William to Tilly was straightforward. That's because there's one main road that cuts through the Western Highlands, a road called the A82. It wasn't the prettiest road. But the appeal of the A82 was he could stay on that road, essentially never leave the road from Fort William to Tilly. All he had to do was just keep up the pace. When biking long distances, you want to aim to be as light as possible. But Tony, he had a heavier mountain bike with a metal frame, larger tires. On his back, he had a rucksack, a backpack that weighed at least 20 pounds. On his feet, he had heavy hiking boots, along with cargo pants and a dense raincoat called a Macintosh. All of that gear, along with the rain and the steep inclines of the highlands. At some point, Tony might have realized this was tough going, and a distance of, say, 40 miles that would have taken 4 hours on a good day with better gear. For Tony, it would take 8 hours. And by the time he was really in the highlands, it was dark, which made visibility extremely important. So Tony wore a classic neon yellow safety vest. But much of his other lighting gear was ad hoc. According to an interview his son did with the BBC, Tony used LED-powered dog collars, clear plastic kind with neon lights, and he wore them like bracelets up and down both arms. The battery life on those LED puppy collars is approximately 6 to 10 hours per charge, which to Tony seemed like enough. Then he added a few more lights here and there until they all joked that Tony looked like a Christmas tree. No doubt Tony had the very best intentions for this ride, but his apparent preparation simply wasn't sufficient for a long, treacherous distance. If he fell and tumbled into a ditch, the water-soaked land along these roads, it was like quicksand. He could get sucked into some peaty bog, maybe even swept away by the rain-activated currents. By 10 o'clock that Friday night, Tony was still on the road, pedaling. And by then, it was likely 8 hours of bicycling. Between the weather and fatigue and hunger and dehydration, along with the possibility of hypothermia. So that night, Tony needed to get off that road, find some temporary refuge for his own health and safety. But where? There is nothing. Just hills and lochs for miles. No hope in sight. So Tony had to keep pedaling, keep going, or he was doomed. It was 10:45 p.m. that Friday night, closing time. By then, most of the customers at this hotel pub were gone. It was hunting season, and the tourists and guides who drank here had to be up early in the morning. Then the bartender noticed a strange man stumble in. He looked like a drowned rat, with close-cropped hair and glasses. And he somehow rolled up in this tiny town, in the middle of nowhere, on a bicycle. This was curious, even suspicious. There wasn't much crime in the Highlands, especially compared to the big Scottish cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow. But you still had to be careful in these parts, especially after a night of drinking, when tempers flared, locals settled old scores, or tourists turned on each other. And with all the amateur hunting that went on around here, alcohol and a guy with a rifle, they didn't mix. And this deep in the Highlands, well, it wasn't the kind of place where you dialed 911. Police were scarce, and there was no real chance of an ambulance. In the best of times, a hospital was a good hour away. So out here was a little bit of the Scottish Wild West. You solved your own problems, made your own rules, and if you got into trouble, you were on your own. But of course, the ever-affable Tony Parsons, he was no threat. And soon the bartender took pity on him and invited him in. The kitchen was closed, but would he like a cup of tea? Tony ordered a cup of coffee, and as he sat and warmed himself up, he shared a bit about his charity ride and how he was nearing the halfway point. This tiny village, named Bridge of Orkney, was roughly 46 miles from Fort William. By then, the hotel manager was in the pub, and he warned Tony that the weather was terrible. This was potentially very dangerous. Would he please spend the night at this hotel? But Tony, he said no. He had it worked out that there was a town called Tyndham about 6 miles away, and he planned to spend the night at a hotel there. The hotel manager again asked Tony if he was sure. He said yes, he'd be fine. So they wished him well and told him to be safe. After Tony finished his coffee, he headed out once again. He got on his bicycle, waved goodbye, and then disappeared into the dark, bleak night. When Vicky was a little girl, she watched her father disappear over and over again. Just about every few weeks, her father would slip into his submarine and vanish from the surface of the water deep into the ocean, somewhere out there. Back then, she always knew her father would come back. He always came back. Now, Vicky was a grown woman in her 30s, and she wasn't so sure. It was Sunday, October 1st, 2017. Vicky hadn't heard from her father all weekend. She'd tried reaching him on Saturday morning just to make sure he was okay, but the call went straight to voicemail. This wasn't wildly unusual. Her father had the boomer habit of forgetting to recharge his smartphone. By Sunday, Vicky feared the worst. Her father had crashed his bike and was in the hospital. Or even worse than that, her father lay in a ditch somewhere. By Sunday evening, Vicky couldn't stand it anymore. She jumped into her car and sped along the A82, the route her father was supposedly on. The A82 was a 2-lane road. She drove northwest, towards the Highlands, hoping she might see her father coming towards her in the opposite direction. Maybe he really was taking his time. Or maybe he was lying on the side of the road. Plenty of trucks and cars sped along the A82, and there wasn't a separate protected bike path. Vicky and her brother worked in law enforcement. Michael had even worked in search and recovery. They'd seen their fair share of tragic accidents. But this didn't make sense. Her dad had to be along this road somewhere. She searched for hours, and nothing. The following morning, Vicky called the police to report her father, Tony Parsons, missing. And it was that day, Monday, October 2nd, 2017. The baffling mystery of the vanishing cyclist began. For 7 days, Scottish authorities threw every resource at this missing person case. On the ground, they searched a 20-mile stretch of that main road, the A82, scouring every divot and ditch for signs of Tony, his bicycle, a helmet, a shoe. The logical prevailing theory was Tony either fell, crashed, or was struck by a car, some kind of accident that had left him injured and by the side of the road. And yet, there was not a single artifact of an accident. Somewhere in the air, an infrared camera attached to a helicopter scanned the West Highlands. This special camera could sense thermal heat, which meant if Tony was still out there, injured but alive, his body would appear on this camera, like a tiny burning ember aglow in the dark. These cameras failed to find any sign of Tony. Complicating matters further was the unpredictable and largely miserable Scottish weather. They did manage to secure some CCTV, and it wasn't much, but they did see Tony get off the train in Fort William around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Then Tony and his bicycle a little later as he passed by a gas station. But the most helpful piece of information came from the staff at the hotel and pub in that village, the Bridge of Orkney. The bartender and hotel manager, they were able to help police narrow down Tony's last known whereabouts and where he was headed next. If these witnesses were right, whatever did happen to Tony, it happened within those 6 miles. From the pub at Bridge of Orkney to the town 6 miles away called Tindrum. So they canvassed the area, asking anyone if they'd noticed a guy on a bicycle that night. They interviewed tourists and locals alike, including the hunting party that was drinking at the pub that night. Had you seen a man on a bicycle, in the rain, anywhere? And they said no, no one had. Then came more CCTV footage. This time, it was from 2 different cameras, but they were aimed at the same road. And these cameras were located several miles apart. But since there was only one main road for all traffic, with no other roads around it, authorities scrutinized every single car and truck captured on each camera that Friday night. And they noted the speed of each vehicle on that first camera, then timed the vehicles to see when they showed up on that second camera. Most cars and trucks were traveling at around the same speed. And they checked to see if a car or truck was seen on that first camera, but took a lot longer to show up on that second camera. This delay would suggest the vehicle had stopped for some reason, like, say, they'd hit someone and tried to hide it. But all the cars and trucks appeared to pass by the 2 cameras at their anticipated pace. What's more, if someone had hit Tony with their car, the front of the car would have been severely damaged. So everything looked normal. But how could that be? Where was Tony Parsons? After 7 days, authorities scaled down this active search. They did everything they could with the resources they had. Meanwhile, Tony's family struggled to understand this mystery. Margaret and Tony were married 40 years, part of each other's lives since she was 17. She couldn't conceive of a life without her husband. And certainly, she would feel if something had happened to him. There was simply no way her husband could be dead. He would come back any day now. She was sure of it. As for Vicky and her brother Michael, they kept turning possible scenarios over and over in their minds. It could drive anyone mad. Did Vicky wait too long to report her father missing? Should Michael have insisted he ride with his father? Why did they let him go alone? As Michael later told the BBC, they had 101 questions, but no answers. Time passed. 2017 became 2018, then 2019, then 2020. At least once a year, someone in the police department would pull up Tony Parsons' file and go through it all over again. Though there wasn't much. A smattering of witness statements, some grainy CCTV footage, 2 seconds of Tony on a bicycle passing a gas station, more footage of trucks and cars driving to and fro. Nothing they hadn't seen before. Nothing that could solve this case. Until there was something new. A new lead, a fresh piece of evidence, a witness who might suddenly come forward. The truth about what happened to Tony Parsons would remain Scotland's most baffling mystery. Dr. Caroline Muirhead had no problem with death. She worked as a forensic pathologist at a hospital mortuary in Glasgow, the biggest and grittiest city in Scotland. No, it was life Caroline had a problem with, because Caroline was 29 years old, and life as she knew it was over. She was on track to have it all. The prestigious career, a cozy home, the perfect husband. They'd even gotten a dog. Then, in the summer of 2020, she discovered the man who was the love of her life turned out to be a scoundrel who committed some unforgivable betrayal that she didn't like to talk about because it was a relationship she didn't want to think about. It was better just to put it behind her and move on. But it wasn't as easy as one might think. One of her friends described that breakup like a thermonuclear bomb had gone off. And this would prove an astoundingly apt metaphor, because a thermonuclear bomb's catastrophic destruction happens in 2 distinct phases. Phase 1 is fission, the initial breaking apart, the atomic split that releases radioactive energy. And that energy propels phase 2. That's fusion. That's the second and even deadlier wave, when particles are drawn together, creating a more destructive and propulsive energy that's 10 times hotter than the sun. One way to think about it might be, phase 1 is lighting a Molotov cocktail. Phase 2 is throwing that flaming Molotov cocktail into a fuel tank. Which meant, in Caroline's case, this initial breakup, it was the flaming Molotov cocktail. What she didn't realize was the fuel tank was right around the corner. And with all this talk of fuel and fire, it only makes sense. Caroline's encounter with a killer would begin on the dating app Tinder. It's been said that when people get divorced or leave a long-term relationship, when they begin dating again, they emotionally regress back to the age they were when they first met their ex. And if that's the case, in the fall of 2020, when Caroline created her Tinder profile, she was essentially the emotional dating age of 21. She was on Tinder to check things out and have a little fun. She wasn't even sure what she was looking for. She only really knew what she didn't want. She didn't want anyone who would remind her of her terrible ex. Now, Glasgow, it is one of the coolest, edgiest, most creatively vibrant cities in Scotland. But on Tinder, she didn't like what she saw. All the guys looked cheesy. Selfies taken shirtless in some dingy bathroom mirror. So Caroline decided to cast a wider net, extending her search to well outside of Glasgow, up to 100 miles away. And it was there, around the edge of 70 miles away, she discovered Sandy. Sandy was a 6'4" Highlander who lived and worked on a massive estate in the West Highlands. His profile was impressive. He was a strapping lad, to say the least. A Scottish Viking, strong enough to split wood with an axe, yet tender enough to hand shear sheep without nicking the animal's delicate skin. In one of his photos, he wore a tartan kilt. Up there, his tartan, in its colors, had probably been in his family for generations. His last name was McKellar, a name with deep ties to that part of Scotland. And according to some ancestry translations, the last name McKellar meant son of the skilled one, even son of the warrior. Caroline saw a rugged adventurer, and maybe more important, someone unlike anyone she'd met before. Caroline swiped right, as did he, of course. Anyone who saw Caroline's profile photo would. In her photos, she was blonde, blue-eyed, athletic, and she was obviously smart and successful. In her profile, she noted she was a forensic pathologist. After a relatively brief exchange, they made plans to meet. Sandy invited her to the estate where he worked as a gameskeeper, an unspoiled property that was 2/3 the size of Glasgow. Caroline couldn't wait to get out of the city and head up to his neck of the woods, a distance of roughly an hour and a half by car. When she told her friends of her plans, they were a little nervous. People can make a lot of dating mistakes when they're on the rebound. Was she sure she wanted to go all the way up to the Highlands to go on a date? What if things didn't work out? You would have driven up there for nothing. Or worse, what if this guy was dangerous? One of her friends made some joke about the possibility of him being a murderer. But Caroline laughed it off. "Get a grip," she said. What's the worst that could happen? So one weekend in the fall of 2020, Caroline headed off, jumping onto the motorway, a route that would take her north past Edinburgh, eventually leading her to the A82, along the same route as Tony Parsons took on his yellow bicycle, nearly around the same time as he did back in 2017. As she drove, Caroline chronicled her journey with a series of selfies and videos she shared with her friends and followers on Snapchat, adding filters and effects that made Caroline's face look like a Disney princess, with garlands of pink flowers around her eyes. Her Snapchat was almost like a visual diary, chronicling her nearly every mood, thought, and action. But of course, like most of us, packaged, filtered, and presented in the way she wanted to be seen. And sure, it was performative. But anyone who caught her Snapchat would know. She wasn't heartbroken anymore. She'd moved on. She was free. Throughout their relationship, Caroline's ex always told her she was too much, too wild, too wacky, too big. But that day, she met big, manly Sandy in the Scottish Highlands. She realized she wasn't too much. It was the rest of the world that wasn't enough. From the very beginning, Caroline felt at home in the Highlands. And for the first time in a long time, she felt appreciated, even adored by this man, Sandy. And she felt protected. Sandy could fix anything, hunt anything, survive off the grid if necessary. And these qualities were particularly attractive in 2020, when the pandemic nurtured a new appreciation for self-reliance. Sandy, along with his twin brother Robert, they were professional hunters. And a key part of a hunter's expertise was teaching the tourists who came to visit the estate how to hunt safely and ethically. And the animals they hunted around the estate were deer. As Sandy explained it to Caroline, the deer roamed in that area in abundance. It was up to the humans, like Sandy and his brother, to ensure the deer population remained balanced. The risk of having too many deer in the Highlands is that it could lead to inbreeding, disease, overpopulation, which leads to the destruction of the ecosystem from overgrazing. And as the larger population searches for more food and more territory, those deer pose a greater risk to humans and themselves by crossing, say, a busy motorway when they shouldn't and getting hit by a car. A disaster that put both the animal and the driver in danger. Now, if you're familiar with the practice of culling, you might know that it is a topic of fierce debate. But in the Highlands, where culling was still practiced by hunters like Sandy, their usual targets are male deer, known as the inferior buck. The inferior bucks are the older or weaker of the species, with the logic being taking out the old and the weak will strengthen the quality of the herd. Ultimately, it's up to a gameskeeper like Sandy to decide which animals were killed, how they were killed, and when. And the general rule for any hunter is shoot to kill, so the animal doesn't suffer. Off the estate, it was hard for Sandy to find a woman who could hear that stuff and not recoil. But Caroline, she understood. And she even admired the way Sandy knew how to field dress an animal. If you thought about it, field dressing an animal and performing a human autopsy, they weren't too far off. So while they may have seemed like they were opposites, they fundamentally shared a mutual attraction, a love of nature, a unique insight into the circle of life. And the two fell in love quickly. But the long distance, an hour-and-a-half drive each way for Caroline, was potentially brutal. So their solution was for Caroline to basically pack a bag and spend her weekends there. Every Friday, she headed up to the estate right after work, and then, come Monday morning at 4 a.m., she would head back down, driving to the hospital for work. Caroline loved being a forensic pathologist, but working in a hospital mortuary was intense, especially in Glasgow. Throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, Glasgow was seen as a dangerous and derelict place, filled with crime and poverty. But by 2020, the city had undergone an incredible transformation. There were cafes, museums, parks, shopping, and yet, even with all of this positive change, the city specifically had one of the lowest life expectancy rates in all of the United Kingdom. Statistically, Glaswegians died young. They were victims of violent crime, suicide, drug overdoses. And if all that didn't kill you, eventually, the drinking, the smoking, and the poor diet would. For a while, there was even a term for it called the Glasgow effect. And they don't use that term anymore, but there's still this prevailing, almost mythical belief that people from Glasgow have a certain attraction to self-destruction. And no doubt Caroline, working in that mortuary, saw it every day. It could be argued Caroline, too, had self-destructive tendencies. Ones that would come to the surface when she got involved with Sandy. Everything about life in the Highlands for Caroline made for the perfect escape. And perhaps no wonder then, when in late November of 2020, after just 2 months of dating, Sandy asked Caroline to marry him. And Caroline said yes. They were engaged. She and Sandy soon posted the incredible news on their socials. And reaction from Caroline's friends and family, it was confusion and concern. But Caroline wouldn't listen to the naysayers. Why should she? She'd already wasted 8 years of her life in a relationship that turned out to be a dead end. So who was to say knowing someone longer was better? Besides, her engagement to Sandy would get her back on schedule. She could be married by 30, start a family soon after that. And perhaps Caroline wouldn't feel like she'd lost all those years. She could have her life back. Caroline had met Sandy's parents. They lived and worked on the estate, and it seems they were excited to have Caroline as their daughter-in-law. Caroline's future mother-in-law even helped her pick out a wedding dress, one that would be custom altered to Caroline's measurements, then shipped to her apartment in Glasgow in a matter of weeks. With everything in motion, Caroline's parents went with it, and they invited Sandy and Caroline to join them for Christmas dinner in December. And just before they were scheduled to go to her family's house for dinner, Caroline had a realization. There were all kinds of things she didn't know about Sandy. And so she almost playfully asked him, okay, now that we're going to be spending the rest of our lives together, I need to know your darkest, deepest secrets. So spill it. Is there anything you've ever done that would potentially hinder this union? Who knows what Caroline expected Sandy to say, but she was surprised by his reaction. He grew serious, even scary. He told Caroline to get in the car. They were going for a drive. And at some point, as they made their way deep into the middle of nowhere, Sandy abruptly pulled over the car and told her to give him her phone. Caroline scoffed at first. Then, seeing the look on his face, she obeyed. Sandy grabbed her phone and turned the power off. Then, as the two sat alone in the woods, he told her the worst thing he'd ever done. Sandy, he'd killed someone. It was late Friday night, September 2017. He'd been drinking, but he got behind the wheel, and while driving along this main road, the A82, he struck and killed a bicyclist. He hadn't even seen the guy. He thought it was maybe a deer. And Sandy told Caroline, the man, he died instantly. And perhaps at first, when hearing this story, Caroline might have thought, people make mistakes. And, well, Sandy wasn't in jail. So obviously, when the police investigated what happened, they figured out he hadn't committed any crime. But, well, here was the thing. The police didn't know about this incident. Because Sandy, with the help of his twin brother Robert, managed to conceal this crime. Sandy jumped back into the truck, hauled off, and pulled away, heading back to the estate. And the reason why the damaged truck did not show up on CCTV was because the direction that Sandy took just happened to be along a private road, back to the estate, and not captured on the second CCTV camera. So when he got back to the estate, he and his brother knew they had to do something. The bicyclist was dead by the side of the road. So they took his brother's truck, drove it back to the main road. They put the dead man into the back of the truck, along with his bicycle and other things, and then drove back home, where they hid the man's body wrapped in a tarp. The two had to work the next day, leading a hunting party along the grounds of the estate. And so the bicyclist's body remained hidden until later that night, that was Saturday night, they found the perfect place to leave this body. In a shallow grave in a peat bog near the same area where they buried animal bones found on the estate. They disposed of his bicycle by pushing it behind one of the property's many waterfalls. And for 3 years, Sandy thought they'd gotten away with it. But wait, there was more. Not too long ago, the estate was sold to a foreign billionaire. And this billionaire had big plans for this vast property. The details were vague, but the overall idea was a massive luxury wellness retreat, like White Lotus in the Highlands. In one of the areas that was going to be key in the development of this project was exactly where this bicyclist was buried. And they needed to find a way to remove that body and ensure it would never be found. And, well, with Caroline's background in forensic pathology, Caroline suddenly realized where this conversation was going. This was more than a confession. It was also an ask, a favor Sandy wanted from his future wife, to use her forensic expertise to tell him how exactly he might dispose of this body to ensure they wouldn't get caught. Now, I'm paraphrasing this a little bit because it's all very complicated. But Caroline, as you might imagine, was stunned. And she was heartbroken. She had thought that this man in this place was her future. And of course, she knew the difference between right and wrong. But what she didn't quite know, not yet, was what to do. But here's what she didn't do. She didn't run screaming into the night, then speed away and go to the nearest police station. Instead, she spent the night at Sandy's place. And as he slept, Caroline Googled who even knew if this was real. And it was that night, under the glowing light of her phone, she discovered who Tony Parsons was, all about the charity bike ride. And she learned the disappearance of Tony Parsons 3 years ago was one of the longest and most baffling mysteries in recent Scottish memory. And Caroline was now the only key to solving it. Caroline would later say her brain was basically broken. It was hard for her to take in what exactly Sandy told her. And so for the next 7 to 10 days, she carried on as if things were normal, including Christmas with her parents and Sandy, introducing this man as her fiancé and yet not revealing the truth. But 2 days after Christmas, she broke down. And she decided to call the police and tell them everything she knew. And when she reported this crime, she described Sandy as her ex-boyfriend, a detail that would become important later in the investigation. Now, over the years, plenty of people came forward giving tips and suggesting leads. And it wasn't uncommon for, say, an ex-girlfriend to get revenge on an ex-boyfriend by accusing him of murder. But when Caroline came to the police station and they interviewed her for 5 hours, Caroline came off as very credible. One of the lead detectives who interviewed Caroline was a woman named Detective Inspector Leslie Ann McGee. D.I. McGee has worked some of Scotland's most heinous crimes, including the recent bust of a large-scale child abuse ring in Glasgow, which ended with the conviction of 7 people. And when she first met Caroline Muirhead, she indeed saw her as a victim. She recognized Caroline had fallen in love with this man, and he'd revealed a terrible secret. And she'd had to make a choice. Either accept the secret and live with it, or do the right thing and report it. But in solving this crime, bringing closure and getting justice for Tony Parsons' family, Caroline had to destroy her own life, or at least the image she had of that life. At some point in December, she came to her senses when she realized, even in Sandy's so-called confession, he told her a lie that would make the difference between an accident and murder. It was Sandy's brother, Robert, who revealed to Caroline the truth about what really happened. After Sandy hit Tony Parsons with the truck, Tony was still alive. He was in terrible shape, but he was still breathing and potentially hoping that Sandy would help him and take him to the hospital. But instead, Sandy abandoned the man. And in this way, Sandy treated Tony worse than he would a hunted animal. because he let Tony Parsons suffer until he died a horrible and lonely death. Now, there's a lot more to the story, of course, but this is already getting to be too long of an episode. And the bottom line was, the police really appreciated Caroline for all of the legwork she did. She brought them evidence and information they never could have gotten without her. And to the police, Caroline was their star witness as they built their case against Sandy and Robert McKellar. That is, until she wasn't. After she revealed all of this to police, she told them she was terrified. And though they assured her the twins would never know she was the one who gave them the information, she asked them for police protection. And they told her they couldn't offer her protection. They didn't have the resources. And at least according to authorities, they operated under the assumption that Caroline was no longer with Sandy. And for what it's worth, they didn't think that Sandy and Robert were going to retaliate against Caroline. If they tried to do anything, it would only prove their guilt. It wasn't in their best interest. And this is where the details around this case get a little strange. Caroline continued her relationship with Sandy. And she became this strange, unofficial double agent. On the one hand, she had Sandy believe that she was loyal, that they were still together. And over the course of several months, as police dug in deeper with their investigation, she got more deeply involved with Sandy, even leaving her job and moving up to the Highlands. And she basically sheltered in place for months at the estate with Sandy, his brother, while she gathered evidence, recording conversations and other material to help the police's case. The three tumbling into a downward spiral of alcohol and drugs. There are audio recordings of Caroline snorting lines of cocaine as she asks Sandy what she thinks are crucial questions about the case. The police maintain they did not ask Caroline to do this. And this behavior, it complicated the prosecution's case immensely. Caroline was supposed to be their star witness. How would they explain why she was hanging out with them all those months? Was she really working for police? Or had love really conquered all reason, all common sense, all sanity? In late 2021, Sandy and his brother Robert were finally arrested and charged with murder. By then, the brothers knew it was Caroline who gave the police a lot of evidence and information. This meant the true test of Caroline's loyalty would come during the trial, which was scheduled for 2023. And this is where the BBC comes in. The BBC had been following this case for a docuseries, and part of the arrangement they had with this investigation was gaining access to the courtroom, which meant the BBC would be present with cameras when Caroline got on the stand and gave her testimony. And suddenly Caroline refused to testify. She claimed the criminal justice system was hanging her out to dry. The way authorities saw it, she was helping them put two killers behind bars. And her refusal to testify was not only against the law, it was counter to everything that she was supposed to have done to help them. Now, the BBC promised Caroline that they would blur her face, disguise her voice, so no one would know who she was. though apparently Caroline says this wasn't true. And the day she was scheduled to testify, everyone sat and waited in court. Caroline was a no-show. Where had she gone? Strangely, she drove from Glasgow all the way back up to the West Highlands in what she said was an attempt to recover the bicycle, the last piece of evidence that she swore she knew was behind a specific waterfall. Though when they went and looked to see if the bicycle was where she said it was, there was nothing. Whether she realized it or not, Caroline's absence weakened their case. And by the next morning, the prosecution and the McKellar brothers, they struck a deal. Murder was off the table, and in its place were lesser charges, including culpable homicide and essentially obstruction of justice. The ultimate sentences handed to the men were 12 years in prison for Sandy and 5 years, more or less, for his brother Robert. Tony Parsons' family, they were upset. As his wife Margaret put it, she got a life sentence. Why didn't his killers? But Tony's family and authorities had to concede, despite Caroline's last-minute antics. Without Caroline's courage in coming forward in the first place, this case would never have been solved. And Tony's family was grateful that finally, after all of these years, they could bring Tony home. As for why they did it, Sandy said in a statement it was because he was afraid. He panicked. He wasn't a psychopath, as some claimed, but a coward. And he actually apologized to Caroline for putting her in the position he did, and he thanked her, because this was, in the end, the right thing to do. And the reason why his brother helped him, well, they were brothers. And as twin brothers, they had a love they believed could conquer anything. Except the truth. Thank you, as always, for listening to the podcast, and thank you for your patience. There will be 3 episodes this month. This episode, another free episode, and of course the May bonus. These longer episodes, as I said, they take about 10 days or so. And it's a real pleasure being able to make them, so I really appreciate your patience and support. Until next time, nighty-night.